This is going to be a reasonably short slideshow about Homer and Hesiod. It's not going to give a lot of information about the plot or content or kind of narrative of the works of these writers. Rather, the aim will be to talk about the philosophical relevance of these writers. This is Christian Perring, and this is for my course on the Introduction to Philosophy. So let's first talk about Homer. And the first thing to say is that the name Homer doesn't really mean very much for us because we don't know who Homer was, and more profoundly, we don't know anything about Homer, including whether Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. So basically, the ancient Greeks were convinced that there was an author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it was a tradition that they called this person Homer. But there's no evidence for that, and in fact there's evidence against it. So that means that we should be pretty skeptical about this idea. One thing we do know is that the tradition of epic poetry was an oral one. That means that there was no written version of the Iliad or the Odyssey when it was first performed. Rather, it was transmitted by a person or a group of people performing it orally. Probably these people traveled from place to place, and they entertained groups of ancient Greeks. Now, how that took place, what form it took, and how often it happened, we have no idea. So, I mean, it does seem that to perform the Iliad takes 2 or 3 days, so that's a pretty significant investment of people's time. Now, they weren't necessarily doing much else, and maybe there were kind of quiet times. If it was a fairly agricultural society, then maybe there are times during the year when the farms don't take so much taking care of. So one thing we also know is that if you're performing something orally, then it's going to be very difficult to give exactly the same version every time without any written record of what you're performing. Generally, there are sort of formulas that speakers or singers use when performing a long work, and they will stick to the kind of the basics, but they will also kind of introduce variation, either unintentionally or intentionally. If you do it unintentionally, it's just because you forget a detail or you misremember a detail, and you tell the story a bit differently one time versus another. Intentionally is where you're trying to basically entertain a group of people, and from their responses you see what goes over well, and if certain approaches go over well, then maybe you expand on that so they're going to be more entertained. That's the nature of improvisation, where you don't just go with what you'd prepared, but rather you expand on it. There were probably hundreds of years between when these works were first performed and when they were written down. So the bottom line is we don't know very much about how these came about, who wrote them, whether there was one author, whether there was many authors, how they were collected together as a one cohesive story. I mean, it does seem that the whole story of the Iliad is mostly compatible with itself. There aren't any self-contradictions. I mean, there are one or two places where possibly there are. And there are also some differences between the Iliad and the Odyssey in terms of plot details. So that's what you'd expect if what is being performed is performed orally by a bunch of different people. So what does happen in the Iliad? Well, I guess one thing I'd say is there are plenty of summaries out there on the internet. There are plenty of videos giving you kind of animated versions. There are movies, and there are probably graphic novels too. So if you want to find out in detail what happens, then either you can read one of those summaries or alternate versions, or you can actually just go and read the Iliad itself. The basic idea is that it's set in the last year of the siege of Troy. Troy is occupied by the Trojans. The people doing the sieging, besieging, I guess is the word, are the Greeks. The Greeks are also known as the Achaeans. In fact, the word Greeks doesn't occur in the version of the Iliad we have. There are also other ways to refer to the Greeks, and if you're not familiar with them, reading the Iliad can be pretty confusing because the same group of people get referred to by different names. And if you're not familiar with it, then you might start thinking, well, these are different groups being referred to. But no, they're the same group. It was probably composed around 750 BCE, before the Common Era, and it's referring to events which probably are meant to have occurred in the 13th century BCE, several hundred years before. So the idea is the storytellers are telling the story of the distant past, even when they were first doing it. Now the plot of the Iliad is not the same thing as the plot of the siege of Troy. I've already mentioned it's only covering the last year of 10 years. It doesn't include the very end of the siege, which the Greeks eventually win and get into Troy and ransack it and destroy it. It doesn't include the death of Achilles. It doesn't include the famous episode of the Trojan horse, where the Greeks trick the Trojans into taking this hollow horse into the city, and inside the hollow horse are hidden some Greek soldiers who, under cover of night, escape from the horse and then open the gates of Troy and let in the Greek army. That's a very famous incident in myth. It's always puzzled me why people didn't think it was totally silly. Why would the Trojans have taken in this horse without double checking it first? They weren't. The whole idea was that they were kind of pretty good at defending themselves, and suddenly they fall for this pretty silly trick. It's a bit of a mystery. So the idea is that the Iliad is just a fairly short part of the whole siege of Troy. It certainly doesn't tell you about how the siege started. So there's a lot of details missed out. There are claims, or I think generally believed claims, that Homer or whoever wrote these stories also wrote many other episodes of the story, and unfortunately those episodes got lost. So it's possible that there was a longer version of the whole thing. What we are clear about is that both the Iliad and the Odyssey were considered to be the most important parts of the story. That's why they survived. And that's not always the case, but on the whole, the things that survive are the ones that were considered most important at the time. People made an effort to copy those stories and reproduce them. So there were, even if some got lost or destroyed, there were others that remained. It's worth remembering that Troy is in Asia Minor, near the sort of northern western coast in modern-day Turkey. So it seems like it was a real place, although there is debate about exactly where it is and what happened. There are archaeological excavations, and it seems that the place that people think was Troy had quite a detailed history, and there are many layers of archaeology to engage in. So exactly which layer corresponds to the siege is also pretty much up for debate. That's kind of some of the background to the Iliad. The Iliad is important partly because it survived so long. The Greeks thought it was important. The Greeks are important to us, so therefore we decide to think that the Iliad is important to us. But maybe more substantially, the Iliad gives us a glimpse into how both the ancient Greeks, maybe the very ancient Greeks, and the kind of Greeks throughout their civilization, for the 1,000 or years that their civilization lasted. 1,000, maybe it's, no, I think 1,000 is fair enough, yeah. How they thought about things like morality and honor and family and friendship and love, and basically how their kind of overall morality was conceived. And certainly when it comes to the central figure of the Iliad, Achilles, what we know is that from the very first lines, the issue is his anger at the way that both he is treated, and then his anger that his true love, his friend Patroclus, was killed by the Trojans. One of the slightly ironic parts of the Iliad is that the great warrior Achilles doesn't actually do a whole lot of fighting in the story. For a large part of the story, he is just sitting at his temporary home outside of Troy. All the main leaders have their own separate temporary homes, and he and his men are busy doing nothing. Why is that? Because Achilles feels he is being offended by the Greek king Agamemnon, and his honor has been besmirched. He hasn't been recognized for the great warrior he is, and so he refuses to fight. then when his friend Patroclus is killed, uh, then he decides he needs to get revenge on the person who killed Patroclus. That person was Hector of the Trojans. So Achilles then proceeds to kill Hector, and then Hector's father comes and begs Achilles for the body of Hector, and after initially being inclined to just kill the father, Achilles ends up handing the body over. It's important to note that the burial of warriors is an especially important ceremony for the ancient Greeks. So to not be buried is a terrible thing. It basically means that you're going to be in torment for the rest of your existence. So the whole story of the Iliad is one of talking about what's important in life, how they define honor, and it's something there's some unclarity about exactly what model of honor they want to adopt, because one of the basic ideas is that honor involves having riches and power and recognition from everyone else. Agamemnon actually does offer Achilles power and riches and recognition, but Achilles says that's not enough. What he wants is an apology. He wants Agamemnon to grovel to him. Agamemnon is not willing to do that. So there's some tension there regarding exactly what do the ancient Greeks mean by honor? Is it just sort of more external things, or is it to a more internal idea of being recognized for who you are? So these are some of the reasons why the plot of the Iliad is so important to us. It gives us a glimpse onto these vital aspects of Greek thought. So let's talk about the Odyssey. The Odyssey is the plot of the Odyssey occurs after the end of the siege of Troy, and basically everybody's gone home apart from Odysseus. Everybody else takes a few weeks or a few months to get home. Odysseus sets out with all his men in his ships, and he takes 10 years to get home. And on the way, he loses all his men and all his ships. He eventually arrives back in Ithaca, and in Ithaca, he discovers that his wife Penelope has been pursued by suitors who want to marry her. The main reason for that is that they want to have all the property that and power that would come from that position of being married to Penelope. And this means that Odysseus is pretty upset that they've been trying to get his wife. Everybody else thought he was dead, but his wife kept on delaying the advances of the suitors. So once Odysseus gets home, he kills all the suitors. Now, why does he take 10 years? Because he was cursed. He was cursed by the god Poseidon, who made his journey very difficult. Why did the god Poseidon make his journey so difficult? Because Odysseus kills Poseidon's son, Polyphemus. Polyphemus is a Cyclops, and so this is the pretty well-known story of the Cyclops, who Odysseus and his men are first trapped by, and then Odysseus tricks the Cyclops and ends up blinding the Cyclops in their escape. So Poseidon gets really mad about this, and therefore he decides to make Odysseus's life a sort of living hell. Although it has to be said that Odysseus does get to have a bunch of affairs on his way home, and part of the reason it takes so long is he starts kind of living with these nymphs. So no, it's not necessarily all bad for Odysseus. He may be married, but he engages in these other activities too. One thing we get from this structure is that the plot of the Odyssey is far more episodic than that of the Iliad. There is different episodes which can be split up, and it's also sort of more fun. In the Odyssey there are monsters, there are more significant female characters, and there's a kind of more diversity of events. So it's a more dynamic story. Um, it's not really as profound in terms of its examination of morality. It doesn't have the same sort of issues. So basically, although it is in many ways informative about many aspects of ancient Greek culture, it's not as morally deep. There's plenty of debate about whether or not the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by the same person or group of people, whether, to put it in a short way, whether Homer wrote them both. Some people think yes, some people think no. Personally, it seems very unlikely to me. Moving on, we have the work of Hesiod. Hesiod was writing around the same time as Homer, which means that there were a group of people who ended up being called Hesiod. Maybe there was a person called Hesiod who wrote everything, or who put together all the stories. It seems a little unlikely. But that's as the ancient Greeks called the writer of the Iliad and the Odyssey Homer, the ancient Greeks called the author of the Theogony Hesiod. The Hesiod is definitely a lot weirder than the works of Homer in that it's much more supernatural. It's much more about how various things got created in fantastic ways. Again, I encourage you to read and to go to the internet to find various sources to see some of the main stories in the Theogony. So it's harder, I think, to draw any sort of deep conclusions about the Theogony and Hesiod's beliefs. But there is something interesting about these various stories about how things happened between the gods, especially if you like stories about gods and supernatural stuff. I've already mentioned that Hesiod's stories were from in a similar tradition, so probably people went around and sang or performed or kind of recited the stories. Maybe there was musical accompaniment, maybe there wasn't. We don't really know about that, or when it was, or maybe there was musical interludes. But it was, the stories were initially told probably in the 8th century BCE, and then they were written down several hundred years later when somebody got around to doing that. A big question, for me at least, it doesn't seem to be one that necessarily bothers a lot of people, is did the ancient Greeks actually believe these stories? Now, certainly the ancient Greeks believed that there was a siege of Troy, and they believed, well, how much did they believe? Did they really believe that there were people called Homer and Odysseus and Agamemnon and Hector and all their wives and children? Um, that's hard to know. Similarly, with the creation stories in the Theogony, did people really believe that stuff? Uh, you know, certainly people like to quote the stories, and you see many references to them. Uh, but that doesn't necessarily mean they actually believe them. They just take them as sort of popular stories which everybody has heard. Um, the fact that stories have survived over the years definitely leads us to think that people took them seriously enough to pass them down, and then eventually they got written down. So there must have been some level of seriousness that they were taken with. It doesn't necessarily follow that people thought they were true. Uh, we might draw a comparison with the Bible. Many people think that the Bible is important, but that doesn't mean everybody thinks the Bible is all literally true with all its stories. Many people would say, well, these are just stories, and we don't necessarily have to believe them as literal stories, but maybe there's some sort of moral or ideas we can take from these stories which are valuable. And similarly, it may be the same with Hesiod and the Theogony. So, since the stories of Hesiod are not so rooted in morality, it's probably going to be harder to say they have a whole lot of philosophical relevance. Uh, These days, of course, we don't think there are anything like any sort of literal truth. We think science gives us the literal truth, not myth. Um, so one of the kind of interesting parts of dealing with people like the Hesiod and his works is that, to what extent uh, do people really believe that stuff? One thing we might note is that people do seem to like to have stories of or explanations for why things are, even if they don't really believe them. It's like the explanations are a kind of substitute for truth, or the myth is a substitute for truth, and people are sort of satisfied by that. Maybe it's a little odd. Why would people be satisfied by something which they don't have any reason to believe? But if we're just dealing with a sort of descriptive truth about people, maybe that is a descriptive truth, that if people are happier to have some kind of story about how things came about rather than to have no story, even if they don't think there's any good reason to believe the story they have. Curious, but possible. Um, we may also uh, we may look at these stories and think, well, the ancient Greeks, if some of them believe this, then this shows how they progressed, because eventually they moved on, at least some of them moved on to a more scientific approach. So this is anticipating the rise of the pre-Socratics and then Plato and Aristotle, and the movements which wanted to have an actual plausible explanation of how things are, not just made up myths. So we can see these stories of Hesiod are important simply because they give us an example of the wrong stuff that people sort of believed. And eventually this gets replaced by other wrong stuff, which is more scientific. I guess one final thing to say is, well, if the ideas of the pre-Socratics about how things came about were wrong, and the myths were wrong, then is that really an advance? If the pre-Socratics are trying to be more scientific about it, and I think, or indeed, can we even draw a distinction between myth and the totally speculative scientific theories of the pre-Socratics? How is one any more scientific than the other if they're both completely not backed up by any evidence? So those are kind of tricky questions which we may try and explore further in our discussion.